In this lesson, we will continue talking about the workflow to create an illustration from start to finish. So every step that we need to take that's necessary to create a clean illustration using all of our tools that we have learned in the previous lessons. So in the previous lesson, we talked about how to start off with sketching and how to color block our different areas in the illustration. We have created various layers and grouped those layers with every element separated. So we have separate planes here, we have separate circles that represent our planets, and we have a separate layer for our astronaut with the outlines and the colored in parts. In this lesson, we will continue by adding details, we will be adding shading and lighting. So let's start off first of all by adding details and lighting to our various planets. As we saw in the previous lesson, we have imported some reference images from which we can take inspiration, or if needed, we can also trace them. So for our planets, we will start by choosing which one we want to take inspiration from. The first one that we will be doing is the one that our astronaut is sitting on, so Saturn. We can look at our various inspirations here on our image, but we can also take some freedom in the way that we want to add details to our planets. So starting off with our Saturn, we can click on our planets, click on Saturn, and add a layer right above that. This layer, we will be using the alpha lock, so everything that we draw on it will only appear on top of this circle. So we can select our freehand path tool here, and in our tool options, let's make sure that under fill, we select foreground color. So in our new layer, we can start drawing some details. So let's start off by drawing some shapes like so. Again, they don't need to be perfect. And then we close it up and notice how it only appears on our circle. Then we can add another layer. Again, select our alpha lock, choose another shade, and again, let's start drawing. So now that we have done this, we can choose if we like the shades that we have chosen, and we can also choose another shade. And on our Saturn layer, we can use our fill tool here and select the planet. We can continue doing this. We can choose if we want, we can change the color, select the layer, and change the color. So we can also go back in and add some details, reselecting our freehand path tool. Make sure that we select the same color. While we're in here, we can also use our eraser tool to add some more details. And we can do the same on the other layer. It doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to have a bit more body and movement. So now that we have reached this phase, we can also add some shadows and lights. So we will start again creating a new layer. We will choose a different color, make sure it's on alpha lock, and then draw out where we want our shade to be. So when we're doing this, we need to make sure to decide before where the light source will come from. So we can decide, for example, that all the lights come from the left or from the right, and so the shadows will be on the opposite side. So in this case, we can choose to put the shadows on the right side of our image. So we can do this again. And notice how that is very dark. This is where our blending methods come in useful. We click on our blending methods in the layer section and we choose which one could be best. Multiply always works for shadows, and then we can work with the opacity and we can create something like so. Notice how that immediately looks more like a shadow. So while we are here, then we can add more details. So maybe on a new layer, again with the alpha lock selected, we can create another bit of shadow like so. And again, we can choose the blending method multiply and bring down the opacity. And see how that now creates a very nice shadow on our planet. And now that we have done the shadow, we can also add lighting. So again, we create a new layer, make sure Alpha Lock is selected, choose a lighter color, and then create a similar semicircle on top. Again, in our blending methods, we can go and choose screen, for example, which is always very good for creating lighting and bring down the opacity. We can also maybe make this slightly bigger while we're on the same layer. And then we can add an extra little detail just on the edge on the new layer, always selecting Alpha Lock. And we can do that like this. And bring down the opacity slightly. So now we have nice shadows and lighting on our planet. Again, remember, we can always go in and change the colors later on. So now that we have started working on Saturn and we at least know our shadows and our colors are going to be like this, we can go ahead and group these together inside our already existing planets group. So we select all of these along with Saturn, right click, group, quick group, and call this Saturn. And then we can close it. So now we can move on to the other planets. Again, we can take inspiration from our reference image. We decided this planet here would be Earth, and selecting our Earth layer, we can create one right above it and select Alpha Lock again. So first of all, we can create this difference in color in the water and create this semicircle on top. And then we can start adding the little pieces of Earth with a green color. So again, new layer, Alpha Lock, and choose a shade of green. Now that we have created these base shapes for the land, we can also momentarily deselect Alpha Lock and hide the layers below. And this is because we want to create details on top of the land. So by hiding the layers below, we can now add a layer on top of this, of the one that we created with the land, choose Alpha Lock, and now add details just to this. Now that we have created these details, we can go back and look at the reference pictures again and maybe add some more details inside. Now that we have done this, we can join this layer with the one below by selecting Merge with Layer Below. And then we can reselect Alpha Lock and reactivate the layers below. So now we can add some more details on the layer below, so on what would be the water. So let's go back to the first layer, add a new one, and again select Alpha Lock, and go back to our shades of blue and add some more details. And we can also select Multiply. And see how that is a nicer shade now, and it appears above both of these layers. And now that we have done these details, we can add some shading and lighting again. So again, new layer, let's select a darker color. Again, now that we have created the details for this planet, we can join all of these layers, select group, quick group, and here we will rename it Earth. So let's move on to Uranus and let's add a layer on top of that. Always selecting Alpha Lock, and let's start drawing. And now that we have added these shapes on the inside of our planet, we can again add some shading. We add another layer on top, make sure we select Alpha Lock. So now we also have Uranus done. So let's select these layers, right click, group, and quick group. So let's move on, and now we can do this one. So same process, we add a new layer, select Alpha Lock, also use our freehand brush tool. So now that we have a bunch of different lines, more squiggly and uneven, we can also add shadow onto this layer. And now we have Venus. So again, let's select all the layers, right click, group, quick group, and we will rename this Venus. And then we can move on to the last planet, which is the sun, before we add maybe some more details to the other ones. Add a layer on top and select again Alpha Lock. With our brush tool, we will choose one of our brushes in here. So the airbrush one would be perfect. So now what we can do is select in our layer group, we can select the last layer with our contiguous selection tool, and then select our glow effect that we just made. And with the freehand brush tool selected and our eraser selected, we can go and cancel out those extra bits that we want hiding behind the layer. So now we have the main parts of our planets done. So we can add a few more details. So for example, on Saturn, we can add these circles that go around it. So let's go to our Saturn layer, open it up, and on the last layer, let's add one more. Let's choose our ellipse tool. Let's make sure in tool options that it's not going to be filled. Then let's start clicking and dragging and choosing how big we want it. Then with the Alt tool, we can move it where we want. And if we select Control at the same time, we can change the inclination. So let's give it a different inclination and then move it with the Alt key selected. And now let's create one more to give it depth. So now inside of this, we can also take our contiguous fill tool and fill in this part. And now we can copy paste this layer. So let's select the duplicate layer. So it's a copy. And then we can resize it and move it in a different position. So we use our transform a layer tool. And then we can select our first layer Saturn, where we have the main circle. With our contiguous selection tool, we just select that. And then we select the layers that we have just created and cancel the parts that we don't need. So these ones, and then select the copy layer and cancel this one out. So it looks like these go behind our planet. So let's add some details to these. Let's add some shadows and lighting. We can also decide to change the colors of our planet a little more, maybe to match these different shades. So we can move on and add this little detail also to Uranus. So let's go to our Uranus folder and add a layer on top. So now we can go over our planets, decide if we want to add some final details, maybe some more lighting. For now, we can leave the planets like this and we can move on. And we can start by first adding a little shadow under our astronaut on top of our planet. So we will go inside of our Saturn folder, select a new layer, select Alpha Lock, and create a shadow underneath. So now we can close the Saturn folder and start working on our layers. As I mentioned before, I want these to be like layers one on top of the other. So we're going to create that effect by adding shadows between one layer and the other. So let's open our layers folder. In between layer 4 and layer 3, we will add a new layer. And in this layer, we will be adding shadows. Before adding shadows, if these are the final colors that we like, or if we want to change them up now, I want them to be a little bit more similar and then that they change mainly with shadowing. So let's choose the main color outside. I still want a shade of purple. So now we have more or less our base colors for the background. Again, we can always go in and modify them. And in the layer that we created between layer 3 and layer 4, we will start adding shadows. So let's take our freehand brush tool, make sure our airbrush brush is selected, and we can choose a darker color, lower the opacity, and just start lightly drawing some shadows. We will make them slightly bigger in some parts and then tighten in other areas. Again, to give it a bit more dimension. So if we like where we are so far, we can try using a blending mode. So like multiply, for example, could be nice, but bringing down the opacity maybe. And let's do the same effect on between the other layers. So moving down between layer 3 and layer 2, we will make another layer and do the same thing. So lower the opacity, make the brush size slightly bigger for now. You can also start with multiply this time. And then let's do it again between the last two layers. And first of all, let's also rename them. And now that we have added all the shadows, we can decide to add highlights. So on top of all the layers, we can just add a new one and call it highlights, and with a light color, and use the brush tool. Let's first select with the contiguous tool the layer that we want to create the highlights on. Okay, so we can do this with the other layers now. So all we need to do is select the layer that we want to put highlights on. So this one now, let's selected with the contiguous selection tool, and then let's click our highlights layer again, and let's add some highlights here. Let's select second last layer, contiguous selection tool, and then go on our highlights layer and choose our brush tool. Then Ctrl Alt A and deselect. So now we have a few highlights also on our layers. Now what we can do is close our layers panel, is close our layers group, and between the layers group and the planets group we can add one layer and create shadows from our planets on this layer. And again, take our freehand brush tool, choose our airbrush tool, bring down the opacity, bring the size a lot more up, and then choose just a dark shade. Now we can also quickly create a starry night scene inside of our last layer, and we can do that very easily by opening our layer panel, going to the very last layer, which is this one, layer 1, and adding a layer on top and selecting the alpha lock. Brush presets, if we scroll down we will find some different styles of brush that can resemble stars, like these ones for example, which are very good. So we can select one, and we can also merge this layer with the one below and call it stars so that we know that it's there. So let's start by adding shadows to our astronaut, which should be pretty quick. Let's look at our reference image and open, so let's close our layers group and open our astronaut group. On top of suit color, let's create a new layer, call it shadows, select alpha lock. And now let's create some shadows. Okay, we can also decide to make this shade slightly darker if we want. And we can do that by bringing this lower and then using our fill tool again, like so. Now we can create another layer right above that and just add some detail. So again, with our paint tool, we can color in the little patch on his suit, and then let's add details to his visor. So select visor, add a layer above, and select alpha tool. And then let's also add a shadow layer, again selecting alpha lock and multiply. So now all we have left to do is to create a little star here in the middle. So we will use a new layer and sketch out a very easy cartoon style star very fast. Then let's add a layer above and use alpha lock, and let's add some details to the star. So now we have a very coloredy star, and we can add a layer below and add some glowing effect to it, the same that we did with the sun. Now all that's left is to add some little details to our fishing rod. And let's just do that on a new layer very quickly using our brush tool with the basic brush preset. And let's just add some details. Now we have filled in and created details all around our illustration, making it more three-dimensional. At this point, we can save our image. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like. If you have any questions or suggestions, make sure to leave them in the comment box. And also don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you can always stay updated on all our lessons and videos. Thanks for following along. I'll see you in the next video.